Good morning. Good to see everyone. Indeed. This is where we are today, 34 and 35. Today's lesson is a one-off, standalone lesson. You didn't have any prep to do for this, and because of the timing of some things in our class and in my personal schedule being flipped around, you may know we were scheduled to go on a little vacation last week, and we had 4 sick children over the last 2 weeks, so we ended up having to postpone that. And so I have had to make some adjustments to the schedule of the class here. So in our last class, we talked about Jerusalem falling and the book of Lamentations, and now I'm going to jump back and talk about some things that happened before the fall of the city. But that was just some scheduling challenges that I had, so I know this is kind of up in the air, but Lord willing, Alan is going to cover, Alan Mosley, I should specify since we have more than one. Alan Mosley is going to teach class on Wednesday. Yeah, Alan Moeller's eyes were real big. Alan Mosley is going to teach class on Wednesday, and he's going to be talking about, I forget the lesson that it is in your table of contents, but it's about the chapters in Jeremiah about the nations, the other Gentile nations, and God's words and judgment to them. And that's just going to be a single class period topic. And then next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll have, if my math is right, we should have, how many classes left? Wait, maybe my math's not right.
18.
Yeah, we should have 2 weeks left, right? Yeah. Two Sundays, 2 Wednesdays. And then that'll help us cover I wanted to end the quarter on a positive note. And so the last 4 classes are going to be the return from captivity and rebuilding and new life coming to Judah and, the blessing chapters of Jeremiah. It's not all gloom and doom, just mostly. But we'll talk about those positive chapters then. So today, chapters 34 and 35, which are not like many chapters in Jeremiah, they are not related chronologically, but topically and thematically. So, Jeremiah 34, look at verse 1. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, with all the kingdoms of the earth that were under his dominion, and all the peoples, were fighting against Jerusalem and against all its cities, saying, Thus says the Lord to Israel, Speak to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and say to him. So, you see where we are then chronologically. We're in the reign of Zedekiah here, and Babylon is threatening. The siege is underway, but Jerusalem has not yet fallen. Now, you may remember from one of our earlier classes, when this is the setting, when Babylon is knocking on the door, Zedekiah goes to Jeremiah and he says, Pray for us. Do you have a word from the Lord for us, right? What can you tell us about how all of these things are going to go? And Jeremiah says, things are going to go really badly. You're going to fall. You need to surrender if you want to even save your life. So while that kind of exchange with Zedekiah and Jeremiah is happening, apparently Zedekiah gets an idea. How can I win God's favor back? And he comes up with this solution. Chapter 34 and verse 8. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people who were in Jerusalem to proclaim release or liberty to them, that each man should set free his male servant and each man his female servant, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, so that no one should keep them, a Jew his brother, in bondage. And all the officials and all the people obeyed, who had entered into the covenant, that each man should set free his male servant and female servant, so that no one should keep them any longer in bondage. They obeyed and set them free. Now, Zedekiah has this idea. The law of Moses, in a few places at least, talked about how Hebrew slaves should be treated. Now, generic qualifier, slavery in the Old Testament Israelite economy was nothing like antebellum slavery in the South. It's two completely different things. And one of the biggest ways that you see a difference, one of the biggest differences between those two things is that the Bible says every 7 years, all slaves were to be released. So a person would be a slave for 7 years, and then he would guarantee his freedom. He would be guaranteed his freedom. Well, that wasn't true in the antebellum South, right? So the problem, though, is for centuries, the Jews apparently disregarded that law about setting the slaves free every 7 years. And so it seems that maybe Zedekiah thought, maybe if we do this, we'll win God's favor back. If I can get the whole nation to agree to set free the captives, then maybe God's favor will come back. Other people have suggested, because the text doesn't tell us why he did it. It just says he made this covenant. He just says he did it. Others have speculated that maybe the reason he did it, and I think there's something to this. Babylon's threatening outside the gates. What would Zedekiah want? More troops to fight against Babylon. So you free all the slaves, especially the male slaves, and you enlist them into the army. Maybe that's what he's doing. Again, we don't know why he does this, but he makes this covenant, he sends out this proclamation, free all of your servants, male and female, and the people buy into this, and they agree to do it. Verse 11, but afterward, they turned around and took back the male servants and the female servants, whom they had set free, and brought them into subjection for male servants and for female servants. Oh, never mind. We were just kidding. Changed our minds. Now, why did they do this? Why would they renege on this offer and this covenant? I think we know the answer. Flip over to chapter 37. Now, we've talked about this chapter before. Do you remember when we studied chapter 37, Babylon has come in siege against Jerusalem, but Pharaoh Hophra down in Egypt said, I don't want Babylon getting a foothold there. So Egypt starts to make their way toward Judah to fight against Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar lifts the siege from Jerusalem and goes down to deal with Egypt. Do you remember talking about that? All right. That happens at this same time. So here's what I think is going on. Babylon is knocking on the doors. They're setting up the siege work. People are beginning to see, hey, this is real. Zedekiah makes this covenant to free all the slaves, enlisting more troops, currying favor with God, whatever his reason is. But when Zedekiah sees Babylon lift the siege from Jerusalem and leave town, he says, we're free. Nothing to worry about. All those slaves, take them all back. Okay? So look at chapter 37 and verse 5. This is what tells us. Pharaoh's army had set out from Egypt, and when the Babylonians who had been besieging Jerusalem heard the report, they lifted the siege. Now, jump back to 34, and let me show you why we make this connection. Chapter 34, verse 21. Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his officials, I will give into the hand of their enemies. All right, this is God speaking. Into the hand of those who seek their life, and into the hand of the army of the king of Babylon, which has gone away from you. You see that? Babylon left. They went away from Judah. And Zedekiah says, threat is over. Great. We're good. Babylon's leaving town. And here God is saying, no, they're going to come back. All right, look at 22. I'm going to command, says the Lord, and I will bring them back to this city. They will fight against it and take it and burn it with fire. So Zedekiah thinks that the Babylonian threat is over because they've left town. And thus all of the people could go back to ignoring God's laws and doing whatever they had wanted to do anyways. That's what they've been doing all along. And now that Babylon is gone, they have God's blessing, or so it seems. All right, you follow me on what's happened? Okay. Now, we read in verse 11 that they took back all the slaves, changed their minds. So verse 12 through 16, God sends Jeremiah to put this breach of the covenant before the nation and say, what are you doing, right? You made this promise to free these captives, and yet you've changed your mind. God says in verse 13, I made a covenant with your forefathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, saying, at the end of 7 years, each of you shall set free his Hebrew brother who has been sold to you and has served you 6 years. You shall send him out free from you. But your forefathers did not obey me or incline their ear to me. And although you recently had turned and done what is right in my sight, each man proclaiming liberty to his neighbor, and you made a covenant before me in the house which is called by my name. Yet you turned and profaned my name, and each man took back his male servant, and each man his female servant whom you had set free, according to their desire, and you brought them into subjection to be your male and female servants. Look at the parallel that God brings up. You made a covenant with your Jewish brethren who were in bondage. Just like centuries ago, I made a covenant with your Jewish ancestors who were in bondage. I brought them out of bondage. We entered into a covenant at Sinai. I blessed them. We were one. You see that parallel? And he says, you are mistreating your Hebrew brothers and sisters. You've broken the covenant with them just as you broke the covenant with me. Therefore, verse 17, God then pronounces a curse and a judgment upon them. You have not obeyed me in proclaiming release, each to his brother. Behold, verse 17, this is interesting. I am proclaiming a release to you, says the Lord. To the sword, to the pestilence, to the famine, and I will make you a terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. I am releasing you, as it were, from this relationship that we share. And I'm releasing you to some really bad stuff. I'm exposing you now to this bad judgment that's going to come. Okay. The people's unfaithfulness to their covenant, to their commitments, to their brothers and sisters in Judaism, and to their God is what I want to emphasize from this chapter. Unfaithfulness. They went back on their word, they made this promise, changed their minds, and God calls them out on that. So when you roll into chapter 35, there is this great contrast put before us. In 35, we have a group of people who are radically faithful to their commitments. All right? So, any questions about 34 before we move on? Alan?
I have not seen, well, I'm looking at verse 18. Where God is saying that you have not performed the words of the covenant which they had made before me when they cut the calf in twain and passed between the parts thereof. I'm not familiar with this as a part of sacrifice of splitting and walking, but do you know anything about that?
Commentaries are mixed on that.
Okay.
Some of what they're saying, and Alan's question is from verse 18, I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not fulfilled the words of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between its parts. Some have said that this is a custom that came along, kind of like in the book of Ruth, the removing of the sandal to have the exchange. So it's a custom that came along that was observed by the people, and it was just a customary sign that should have meant something, right? That said, hey, we're entering into this agreement together. Others have said, well, yes, that's true, but God is kind of using it as a play on the image, and he's saying, just like that calf was cut in pieces, you're going to get cut in pieces when Babylon comes in. So I don't really have a strong preference on how to understand that. But
I can't recall any other passage that describes this.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I thought about was with covenants in Exodus 24, I think, when the covenant was ratified, it talked about Moses sprinkling blood on the people. There was obviously a sacrifice offered with that, and so maybe that's a hint of where this custom might have come from. Chris?
Was there not a one-sided covenant somewhere in the Bible? Obviously, I haven't had a chance to figure out where this is, where God himself walked through the animals, the sacrifice, but it was one-sided while whoever it was that was with him at the time was sleeping, or something. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to look it up. I think
This sounds like a good extra credit homework project, Chris.
You don't know that.
That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like to me. All right. Yes, please report back. Jeremiah 35. This happens, verse 1 says, in the days of Jehoiakim. So he was the king before Zedekiah was. So that's why I say chronologically these are not together. But, verse 2, Jeremiah is told, go to the house of the Rechabites and speak to them and bring them into the house of the Lord. Okay, the Rechabites. They were descendants of a man named Rechab, of course, but there is particular emphasis given to one of their ancestors named Jonadab. His story, although brief, is recorded earlier in the book of 2 Kings. Think back to the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab, extremely wicked king, very evil reign that instituted Baal worship to the nation and made that very prevalent. God prophetically says he's going to punish King Ahab and all of his house. His descendants, they're going to be destroyed. And that prophecy is fulfilled at the hands of a man named Jehu, who later became a king in Israel. Now flip back with me to 2 Kings chapter 10. We're going to read about this man Jonadab. 2 Kings chapter 10. So Jezebel has died in chapter 9. In chapter 10, Jehu begins to carry out this judgment against the house of Ahab, as was foretold. Jehu, in chapter 10 and verse 15, he departed from there and he met Jonadab, or Jehonadab, your translation might say, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he greeted him and said to him, is your heart right as my heart is with your heart? And Jehonadab said, it is. So Jehu said, if it is, give me your hand. And he gave him his hand, and he took him up to him in the chariot. He said, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. So he made him ride in his chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he killed all who remained to Ahab in Samaria until he had destroyed him, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke to Elijah. All right. The idea here is that Jehu is carrying out this slaughter of Ahab's household. And he meets Jonadab along the road and basically says, are you with me in what I'm doing, or are you against me? Jonadab says, I'm with you. Great. So Jehu extends his hand, pulls him up into the chariot, and then they ride off to Samaria, and Jehu kind of says, watch this. I'm going to go kill everybody who's left in Ahab's house. This is all we're told about Jonadab. Nothing else is said about him until we get to Jeremiah 35, much, much later chronologically. So what's going on here? Well, Jonadab, at least it seems from this chapter that there's one of two things that's possibly happening. One, he truly did support Jehu, and he supported Jehu's efforts to slaughter and destroy the house of Ahab. Jonadab knew, hey, this is what Elijah said was going to happen. That was a prophecy that came from God, and I need to get behind this. He was a supporter of Jehu. The other possibility that some have offered is, well, he's not really a supporter of Jehu because Jehu's kind of a bloodthirsty, power-hungry savage, but Jonadab realizes, yeah, I'm with you, Jehu, because, if I say I'm not, you're probably going to kill me too, just like you would the sons of Ahab. All right, not exactly sure what it is that's going on. Doesn't really matter. What matters is what Jeremiah says in chapter 35 about this man, Jonadab. So let's look at this. Jeremiah 35. Jeremiah is told to point out the evil of the nation of Judah by contrasting their evil and unfaithfulness with this group of people called the Rechabites. So in verse 2, we read a part of a moment ago, Jeremiah is told, bring the Rechabites into the temple, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink. So, verse 5, I set before the men of the house of the Rechabites pitchers full of wine and cups, and I said to them, drink wine. But they won't drink. They refuse. Now the question is why? Verse 6, we will not drink wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, the man that we read about in 2 Kings 10, he commanded us, saying, you shall not drink wine, you or your sons, forever. You shall not build a house, you shall not sow seed, and you shall not plant a vineyard or own one. But in tents you shall dwell all your days, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. Jonadab, their forefather, laid out these stipulations for his family. Don't drink wine, don't plant vineyards, don't build houses, live as nomads, wander around living in tents. Now that may seem kind of extreme. Why would he make those requirements upon them? But whatever the reasons were, and I think there is a reason, and we'll come back to that in just a second, but whatever his reasoning was, his descendants 250 years later are still following their ancestors' commands. So, verse 10, they say, we have only dwelt in tents and have obeyed and done according to all that Jonadab our father has commanded us. We are this small nomadic band of people who live in this weird kind of a way by everybody else's standards. And verse 11 tells us the only reason that they've come to Jerusalem. When Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the land, we said, come and let us go to Jerusalem. We've only come into the city of Jerusalem for safety. We don't want to be slaughtered by Nebuchadnezzar as we're out living in the wilderness. So while this nomadic, bizarre lifestyle group of people, the Rechabites, come into Jerusalem, God says, there's a teaching opportunity here. Jeremiah, take the Rechabites into the temple in front of everybody else in the nation and put them to the test. Drink wine. No, we're not going to do that. Why are you not going to do that? Because our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Jonadab told us we shouldn't do that. What are you seeing about this small, weird band of people, the Rechabites? What stands out? Their obedience. Their faithfulness. Faithfulness to a command, not from God, but from great-great-great-great-grandpa. 250 years ago. They are still following the instructions of him. And yet this whole nation in Judah won't follow any of the commands of God. Not grandpa, who's just a man. but they won't follow the commands of God that he gave them yesterday, much less the commands that he gave Moses centuries before. You see that difference? This great contrast? So, as God is using the Rechabites as this indicting example set before the nation, he explains this. Verse 13, "Go and say to the men of Judah, will you not receive instruction by listening to my words? The words of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, which he commanded his sons not to drink wine, are observed. So they do not drink wine to this day, for they have obeyed their father's command. But I have spoken to you again and again, and yet you have not listened to me. I have sent to you all my prophets, sending them again and again, saying, turn every man from his evil way, but you have not listened to me. Indeed, the sons of Jonadab, 16, the son of Rechab, have observed the command of their father, which he commanded them, but this people has not listened to me." So why does Jonadab give this command to his family 2.5 centuries previously? I'm going to connect some dots here. I don't know that I can prove this, but I'm inferring this from what is said. Jonadab lives through the reign of wicked King Ahab, and he sees how the nation of Israel is being led into wickedness. And Jonadab takes a stand and he says, my family is not going to do that. We're not going to live like everybody else. And even if we are labeled as extremists, so be it. We're not going to do these things. We're not going to drink wine. We're not going to settle down in this place because this world is not our home. We're going to go around living in tents and we'll just live wherever we want. We'll take care of ourselves and we don't need to have these other influences around us. And God uses this group of nomadic people in the city to make a point of contrast about faithfulness and faithlessness. You see that? All right. The rest of the chapter is in verse 17 through 19. There is a blessing and a promise that's given to the Rechabites that God says, you'll always have a man who stands before me. So God speaks well of this group of people because of how they have lived. I think this is a really incredible story. Mary Gail?
My study Bible says that there are still followers of this group are still alive in the Middle East.
Yeah, so I tried to track that down. I have a Bible dictionary that makes a reference to a doctor so-and-so, like a PhD, not a medical doctor, who studied this kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, he's an archaeologist or something, and he went to the biblical Jerusalem and the land of Palestine trying to search for some of these things that confirm the scriptures, and he claims to have come across a man who is a descendant of this very group and said he found a group of people, about 60,000 in number, who are still in the land of Palestine today. Now, that was when Dr. So-and-so wrote this, which was like back in the early 1900s. But I couldn't actually track down his paper. But the Bible dictionary claims that it's out there. So pretty incredible that there's this group of people that is still out there, and that would stand to support the promise that God made here. All right. This is one of those stories that you love to teach and preach about, because it's very powerful, talking about this man Jonadab and his influence and what he did in taking a stand for what's good and right, and how his legacy continued on for centuries after his death. A wonderful testament to this group of people who listened and cared so deeply about their ancestors and what they said and what they wanted. And I think one of the takeaways for me in this, and this kind of ties into what I'm going to be preaching this morning, but I think sometimes as Christian fathers and mothers who are trying to do the right things, who are trying to teach our children and grandchildren the things of God, we may have this feeling from time to time that, well, what we're doing doesn't really matter. It's not going to work anyways. You know, the devil's just too strong. The influence of the world is too great. I just don't see how we're going to be able to overcome that. And then you read stories like this, where a man had a lasting legacy and an impact on multiple generations down the road. And I think this is a story that should make us sit up and say, hey, you know what? The things that we're trying to teach our children do matter. And if they will take this to heart, yes, we have to teach it, but that's only part of the equation. You know, our kids have to take it to heart. But what we're doing can have a lasting effect if our children and grandchildren will make it their own, take it to heart, and implement these things into their lives, and then just pass it on down generation after generation. This is an example of someone doing that very thing.
This is what I'm seeing, is that they are so by themselves, and I think of the gypsies in other countries where they are a community to themselves and they don't let outside influences, and that's where I see they are staying in a more...
Yeah, the nomadic lifestyle would certainly lend itself to that. This is our group, and there's very little outside influence.
So much of our bringing up children now is all the influences of what this world...
Yeah, and I think one of the quick things that we often hear is, well, as Christians today, we can't just isolate ourselves. We can't become monks off in some, monastery somewhere. We have to be out in the world and have an influence. And that's certainly true. That is certainly true. We do have to be an influence as much as we can in the world. And yet, I don't think we should dismiss entirely this notion of sheltering ourselves a little bit, at least. Hunkering down a little bit. There is something to be said for that. Maybe not as a permanent thing. I'll give you this example. All of the things that you're seeing in the news now about how children are being targeted for sexual things and things that are far beyond what young children should be exposed to. Those kinds of stories make me think, the monastic life ain't so bad. and introduce things as, the children get older and as things are more age appropriate. Bring those things in on our terms instead of letting the world do those on their terms. So that's kind of a soapbox thing, but the idea of separation of ourselves is probably something that, at least to a degree, we should take more seriously and consider. Now, practically speaking, how do you do that? That's something we could discuss, but I love this story. It's very powerful. Alan?
It is powerful. There's another facet to this, though, that I think is worthy of consideration. What you're talking about is specific, concerted lessons that we want to teach our children so that they'll take on in their lives. But, one of the laws of nature is that every action has a reaction. And nobody lives their life in a vacuum. And sometimes we think, nobody's watching me, nobody's listening to me, I don't matter. And I've actually done some thinking about this within my own family and the history of my family. And way back in 1936, my dad was born in 1933. In 1936, at the height of the Depression in the Deep South, where my grandfather had a little plot that he sharecropped, had enough, and him and his brother sold everything they had, and they bought an old used school bus. They piled all of their family in that, and my 3-year-old, who was now my dad, he was on that bus. and they traveled to California not knowing anybody or anything or having any prospects, but they just heard that it was the land of opportunity. And so they settled there on the coast of California, and he met my mom, who they had a very similar story. And so these two people came together and then produced me and my sister, and we were kind of raised in that area. I met my wife there, and then we moved back this way, and my daughters-in-law have all thanked me for doing that, thinking I changed my decision to move back has changed their lives. And if you start to paint all this picture together, what anybody in this room could do is look back over their family history and see how the decisions of their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents have some effect in their life today, and how my decision is having an effect on my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren who are not even born yet. So don't ever think that you don't matter.
Yeah.
Even the lessons that you don't think, or the actions that you're taking that you don't think really have much of effect, they have effect. Somewhere along the line, that action that you've taken is going to filter down and it's going to affect something. And so we need to understand that we control whether or not it's going to affect something in a positive way or in a negative way. And so I think that lesson is very well taken, and we should understand we have a lot more influence and a lot more power over the future than what we think we do.
Yeah, well said. Did you all notice that he said great-grandchildren who have not been born yet? Trying to tell us something?
Yeah, no.
All right, yeah, a little Freudian slip there, huh? Okay, that's all I've got.